For millennia, ancient cultures from around the world have shared surprisingly similar narratives about great cataclysms that nearly extinguished humanity. From Sumerian tablets to Vedic texts, from Egyptian hieroglyphics to Mayan legends, we find references to advanced civilizations that suddenly disappeared, leaving only fragments of their knowledge. Most intriguing is that independent researchers have documented geological and astronomical patterns suggesting cycles of destruction and rebirth on a planetary scale approximately every 12,000 years, coinciding with what ancient texts call the cosmic breath. What few know is that there is a rare genetic anomaly, present in only 7% of the current world population, recently identified as haplogroup X2b Taichi. Carriers of this genetic sequence demonstrate peculiar cognitive abilities that make them naturally resistant to certain forms of social conditioning and allow them to access what some researchers call collective ancestral memory, remembrance of events prior to the great planetary resets. But who would be the mysterious architects so committed to eliminating this genetic trait from the human population? And why has this information been systematically suppressed from official academic records? The history of human genetics that we learn in classrooms is just the tip of an immense iceberg. In 1997, a multidisciplinary team led by geneticist Dr. Elias Sternberg began investigating anomalies in human chromosome 7 after noticing unexplainable patterns in certain individuals during functional magnetic resonance imaging studies. What initially seemed to be a simple genetic variation of no importance revealed itself to be a complex coding sequence that they informally named the Maat sequence, in reference to the Egyptian goddess of truth and justice, due to the peculiar ability of these individuals to detect narrative inconsistencies. Carriers of this genetic variation present an atypical neural configuration, with denser synaptic connections between the hippocampus, memory center, and the prefrontal cortex, responsible for critical thinking. This differentiated brain structure allows what researchers called nonlinear cognition, the ability to process information in patterns that transcend the limitations of common sequential thinking. In practical terms, this manifests as a natural resistance to accepting simplistic explanations for complex events and a tendency to question established narratives, even when universally accepted. Curiously, statistical analyses revealed that this genetic variation is present in only 7% of the current world population, but its frequency was significantly higher in DNA samples extracted from ancient remains, particularly those dated between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, precisely the period that coincides with the end of the last ice age. What could explain this sharp decline in the prevalence of this genetic characteristic over the millennia? Could it have been a natural selection process or something more directed? Researchers were especially intrigued to discover that the complete activation of this genetic sequence happens only during specific astronomical events, particularly when Earth traverses certain regions of space with increased cosmic plasma density. These periods coincide with what ancient traditions call the opening of celestial portals, or times of revelation. During these intervals, carriers of the MAAT gene report experiences of expanded consciousness, including the ability to access what they describe as memories that don't belong to me, vivid fragments of historical events they could never have witnessed in their current life. In 2003, when Dr. Sternberg's team was about to publish their preliminary findings in the prestigious Journal of Evolutionary Genomics, a strange incident occurred. The entire laboratory suffered a devastating fire that destroyed years of research, including tissue samples, genetic sequencing, and computerized data. 3 days later, Dr. Sternberg himself mysteriously disappeared during a conference in Zurich, leaving behind only an encoded notebook that was recovered by his assistant, Dr. Sophia Chen. What forces might be interested in preventing this knowledge from reaching the public? The subsequent phylogenetic analysis of haplogroup X2b Taichi, as it was later classified in scientific nomenclature, revealed an even more surprising characteristic. It does not follow normal evolutionary patterns. While most human genetic variations can be traced to gradual mutations over tens of thousands of years, this specific sequence appeared suddenly in the human genetic record approximately 70,000 years ago, coinciding with an explosive cognitive and cultural development in the human species that anthropologists call the Great Leap Forward, a period when art, symbolic language, and complex rituals emerged almost simultaneously in geographically isolated human populations. The clandestine work continued through an informal network of independent researchers who called themselves the Prometheus Project, referencing the Greek titan who brought the fire of knowledge to humanity against the gods' will. Using private laboratories and anonymous funding, these scientists mapped the global distribution of the MAAT gene and made an alarming discovery. Most carriers of this genetic variation tended to occupy positions of cultural influence as philosophers, revolutionary artists, disruptive inventors, and leaders of social reform movements throughout history. Could it be mere coincidence that so many catalysts of profound changes in society shared this same genetic peculiarity? The relationship between the MAAT gene and ancient esoteric knowledge became even more evident when Prometheus Project researchers began analyzing Hermetic texts and records of mystery traditions. They found detailed descriptions of initiatic practices designed to awaken the inner eye of Horus, which, when analyzed in light of modern neuroscience, revealed themselves as precise methods to stimulate the same brain regions affected by the expression of the MAAT gene. The ancients already knew about this genetic variation and developed techniques to enhance it, even without the scientific vocabulary we have today. Particularly revealing was the study conducted by Dr. Aisha Nwabudike in 2017, which analyzed the brain wave patterns of 108 confirmed carriers of the MAAT gene during deep meditative states. The electroencephalogram showed an unusual synchronization between the cerebral hemispheres and the formation of coherent gamma wave patterns at frequencies of 40 to 42 Hz, exactly the same neural signature documented in Tibetan monks during states of universal consciousness. The crucial difference is that these individuals reached such states without decades of meditative training, suggesting a natural predisposition to access altered states of consciousness. The most controversial aspect of the research emerged when geneticists from the Prometheus Project conducted comparative analyses between modern human DNA and fragments recovered from Egyptian mummies, especially those associated with the royal lineage of the 18th dynasty, the period when Akhenaten's monotheism attempted to replace the traditional Egyptian pantheon. The results showed an extraordinarily high concentration of the MAAT gene in these ancient samples, suggesting that this royal family possessed a frequency of haplogroup X2b Taichi almost 10 times higher than the current population average. This data raises a provocative question. Could it be a coincidence that precisely the pharaoh who challenged the entire religious establishment of his time belonged to a genetic lineage marked by resistance to mental conditioning and an elevated capacity for independent thinking? Evidence of an extremely advanced controlling civilization is hidden in plain sight throughout our planet. Recent analyses of megalithic sites such as Puma Punku in Bolivia, Baalbek in Lebanon, and the underwater platforms of Yonaguni in Japan reveal identical mathematical patterns and construction techniques impossible to reproduce even with our current technology. Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University documented that many of these monuments show signs of water erosion that could only have occurred more than 12,000 years ago, when these sites were supposedly inhabited by primitive hunter-gatherers. Even more intriguing is that advanced spectroscopy analyses detected residual traces of an unknown material in the stone joints at Sacsayhuaman, Peru, a metallic alloy with superconducting properties that does not correspond to any known element in the modern periodic table. Who possessed this advanced technology in such a remote past? The so-called architects do not appear to be a single entity, but a complex hierarchy operating at different levels of physical manifestation. Sumerian manuscripts recovered from private Vatican libraries describe the Anunnaki as having 7 distinct castes, each with specific functions. The planners, long-term strategists. The geneticists, manipulators of human biology. The recorders, guardians of cosmic history. The supervisors, constant monitoring of human development. The instructors, responsible for the controlled dissemination of knowledge. The repairers, who intervene during cataclysms, and the enigmatic observers, who remain completely separate, only witnessing. This organizational structure explains the apparent contradictions in ancient records. While some entities seemed benevolent, others demonstrated a calculating coldness toward human suffering. Extraordinarily revealing was the 1976 discovery by archaeologist William Niven of 2,600 stone plates in Acambaro, Mexico, containing a pictographic language that remained undeciphered until 2011. When finally translated by linguist Dr. Elena Korshinova, it revealed a shocking document, an operation manual for something described as a consciential modulation network, a technological system apparently installed at strategic points on the planet to calibrate the mental frequencies of human beings within acceptable parameters. The document details how this technology uses Earth's own magnetic grid, enhanced by strategically positioned megalithic structures, to generate morphogenetic fields that limit certain neurological functions in the general population, while identifying and marking for recalibration individuals whose brain frequencies escape these controlled parameters. Could MAAT gene carriers be naturally resisting this planetary mind control technology? The persistence of the architects in our history is manifested not only through periodic cataclysmic interventions, but also through their apparent control over specific institutions of power throughout the millennia. British historian Sir Lawrence Gardner meticulously documented how certain genetic lineages were carefully maintained through arranged marriages between royal and noble families since antiquity. These sanctioned lineages frequently share peculiar physical characteristics: elongated skulls, 6 fingers, Rh-negative blood, and pineal gland anomalies. More significant is that clandestine genetic analyses conducted in 2008 on blood samples from these families revealed genetic markers incompatible with conventional Homo sapiens, suggesting that these individuals are literally hybrids, lineages constructed to serve as intermediaries between the architects and the general human population. Especially disturbing is the discovery of a global network of underground facilities dating back more than 20,000 years, interconnected by tunnels that defy conventional explanations. From the Derinkuyu caves in Turkey to the underwater structures along the coast of Cuba, these facilities present consistent features: advanced ventilation systems, protection against electromagnetic radiation, precise stellar representations, and chambers that ancient texts call regeneration rooms. Nuclear physicist Dr. Artem Mikoyan proposed in 2019 that these facilities were designed as survival arks to preserve certain genetic lineages during planned cataclysmic events, a selective evacuation system activated before each planetary reset. Analyses of the mineral content of the walls of these structures revealed properties of shielding against cosmic radiation and high-intensity electromagnetic pulses, exactly the type of protection needed during events such as magnetic inversions or extreme solar flares. The architect's strategy to neutralize MAAT gene carriers has evolved dramatically over time. Ancient records describe direct physical eliminations during prehistoric periods, evolving into more sophisticated control systems. Byzantine documents rescued from Caesarea mention the establishment of a secret order called Guardians of the Human Mind, charged with identifying individuals with the glow of unauthorized divinity in their eyes, a poetic reference to the neurological indicators of MAAT gene carriers. This order eventually infiltrated religious and academic institutions, creating protocols for early identification and cognitive reorientation for children who demonstrated signs of excessive independent thinking. In modern times, this approach has evolved into subtle pharmacological and technological methods, including specific compounds introduced into water and food that selectively suppress MAAT gene expression, and pulsed electromagnetic fields calibrated to interfere with brain frequencies associated with nonlinear cognition. Access to the complete historical records of humanity appears to be one of the main operational advantages of the architects. Sumerian texts refer to a facility called Eabzu, literally House of Knowledge of the Deep Waters, described as a repository containing complete records of all previous civilizational cycles. Circumstantial evidence indicates that this monumental archive remains operational, probably located under the Mediterranean Sea between Cyprus and the Egyptian coast, in an area that demonstrates significant gravitational and magnetic anomalies detected by satellites. Independent researchers theorize that the architects maintain this repository as a management manual to optimize their methods of civilizational control, learning from previous interventions which methods are most efficient for directing human development without provoking organized resistance. Exclusive access to this complete historical knowledge provides them with an incalculable strategic advantage in the long-term management of humanity. Surprisingly, growing evidence suggests significant internal conflicts between different factions of the architects. Gnostic texts refer to an ancient division between the conformists, who advocate maintaining humanity in a controlled state of limited development, and the dissidents, who advocate for the complete liberation of human genetic potential, including the universal expression of the MAAT gene. This fundamental schism would explain the apparent contradictions in historical records, where some advanced entities seem to help human development while others actively work to limit it. Egyptologist Dr. Carmen Bolter identified distinct representations of these factions in the temples of Karnak and Abydos, where hieroglyphs describe a celestial war between the lords of fixed form and the emissaries of the blue flame, an apparent coded reference to this cosmic ideological conflict over the evolutionary destiny of humanity. Could we be witnessing the final stages of this millennial conflict? Particularly alarming is the correlation between certain human technological advances and subsequent catastrophic events. Whenever previous civilizations came close to developing free energy technologies, instant communication, or space-time manipulation, the same fields we are currently exploring with advanced quantum physics, some devastating event abruptly interrupted that progress. Dr. Michio Hoshino, theoretical physicist at Kyoto University, analyzed these historical patterns and concluded that there is a supervised technological barrier that no human civilization is allowed to cross. His mathematical analysis of known historical cycles projects that we are dangerously close to reaching this critical point again, with our current exponential development in artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and quantum physics. His projections suggest a window of only 7 to 12 years before we cross some forbidden threshold that would potentially trigger another reset event. The crucial question is, can we this time recognize the pattern in time to interrupt it? The most hopeful aspect of this investigation is the identification of an anomaly in the current cycle. For the first time in recorded millennia, the frequency of the MAAT gene in the population is increasing instead of decreasing, having doubled from 3.5% to 7% in just the last 3 generations. This phenomenon coincides with the documented weakening of Earth's magnetic field, which apparently interferes with the consciential modulation systems established by the architects. Physicist Dr. Pavel Sorokin proposed in 2020 that we are entering a region of space with different quantum properties, which naturally amplify the brain frequencies associated with the MAAT gene while neutralizing consciential suppression technologies. If his hypothesis is correct, we are on the threshold of an unprecedented window of opportunity, a period when the architect's control systems are temporarily weakened, allowing a critical number of humans to fully awaken to their genetic potential before any corrective intervention can be implemented. Could humanity finally be about to break the cycle of imposed cosmic amnesia? The mechanism by which the MAAT gene allows its carriers to resist planetary forgetting cycles has finally begun to be understood thanks to revolutionary works in quantum biophysics. Researcher Dr. Sophia Natto discovered that carriers' DNA contains an extraordinary molecular structure, protein microtubules that form quantum resonant cavities capable of storing information not only biochemically but as quantum interference patterns, similar to pure-state holograms. These unique cellular structures function as biological hard drives that remain intact even when exposed to the intense electromagnetic radiation that typically accompanies geomagnetic inversions and extreme solar events. While conventional brain tissue has its memories erased during these cataclysmic events, these quantum structures preserve intact the essence of individual consciousness and collective memory, allowing the carrier to reload their neurological system after the event, like a computer restoring data from an external backup after a catastrophic failure. The gene carriers have developed over millennia a sophisticated system of temporal markers, coded signals left between civilizational cycles to guide future carriers. These markers are not mere physical artifacts, which could be destroyed, but precise mathematical patterns incorporated into the very architecture of megalithic structures carefully positioned at planetary energy vortex points. Archaeologist Dr. Randall Peterson documented how certain geometric proportions consistently appear in ancient monuments, from Göbekli Tepe to Angkor Wat, that trigger specific neurological responses only in brains with the synaptic connections characteristic of MAAT gene carriers. When contemplating these structures from precise angles and lighting, carriers experience sudden mnemonic discharges, memory fragments from the previous civilizations that built these structures. These architectures literally function as collective memory storage devices, accessible only to those with the correct neurological hardware to decode them. Extraordinarily revolutionary was the discovery of the Cascade awakening phenomenon among MAAT gene carriers. Neuroscientist Dr. Hideo Takahashi documented how a fully activated carrier can catalyze gene expression in other latent carriers through a process he called neural morphogenetic resonance. When a group of individuals, of which only one had the fully activated MAAT gene, remained in proximity for 14 days, the electroencephalograms of the participants began to gradually synchronize with the patterns of the activated carrier. Even more impressive, blood tests revealed epigenetic changes in the participants, with DNA methylation markers indicating activation of previously dormant genetic segments. This phenomenon explains historical accounts of mass awakenings after the emergence of certain catalytic individuals, from Hypatia of Alexandria to Giordano Bruno, who seemed to ignite a cognitive flame in everyone around them, often resulting in their persecution by authorities who intuitively recognized the threat of this cascade activation. The implications of discovering living libraries are perhaps the most profound for our understanding of resistance to resets. Dr. Elena Kazekov identified that MAAT gene carriers store knowledge not just in their brains, but in every cell of their bodies through a process called distributed holonomic encoding. This biomolecular storage structure uses the intracellular water molecules themselves as a recording medium, leveraging the recently discovered properties of structured water to maintain stable information patterns. As a result, even if the physical brain is damaged during cataclysmic events, the information can be reconstructed from any surviving fragment of cellular tissue, similar to how a broken hologram still contains the complete image in each of its fragments. Various historical accounts of prodigy children who demonstrated impossible knowledge at an early age gain new light under this perspective. These would not be reincarnated souls in the traditional sense, but conscious reconstructions from preserved cellular structures of previous lives. The connection between the MAAT gene and the zero-point quantum field was rigorously demonstrated by physicist Dr. Catherine Harriman, who observed that the brain microtubules of carriers exhibit quantum coherence at much higher temperatures than normally possible in biological systems. Her experiments revealed that these unique neural systems function as quantum antennas that can access and store information directly from what physicists call the Planck vacuum, the fundamental substrate of reality where information is never lost. During periods of extreme crisis, such as global cataclysmic events, gene carriers can unconsciously upload their essential memories to this non-local informational field. After the event, when a new gene carrier is born with the appropriate receptive neural structure, these memories can be gradually downloaded back into individual consciousness, explaining the persistent reports throughout history of children who relate detailed memories of lost civilizations they could never have known through conventional means. The extraordinarily well-documented case of Heinrich Schliemann, the discoverer of Troy, exemplifies the practical functioning of the MAAT gene against the cycles of forgetting. Since childhood, Schliemann had recurring vivid dreams of an ancient city surrounded by massive walls, with architectural details he could not have known through the education of his time. Following these impossible memories, he precisely located the site of Troy, a city considered purely mythological by scholars of his time. Posthumous analyses of private documents reveal that Schliemann recorded dozens of details about the city before its excavation that were later confirmed with surprising accuracy, including aspects completely unknown in the available literature. Recent genetic studies of Schliemann's descendants confirmed the presence of haplogroup X2b Taichi, suggesting that his archaeological intuitions were actually memories preserved through civilizational cycles, a MAAT gene carrier recovering knowledge that survived the Trojan reset. Over millennia, MAAT gene carriers have developed sophisticated techniques to amplify their innate abilities to resist resets. Alchemical manuscripts recovered from Tibetan monastic libraries detail a process called fixing the celestial mercury, a series of psychophysical practices that strengthen the connections between the physical brain and what they describe as the informational light body. This training involves specific meditative states combined with botanical compounds that increase neuroplasticity and stimulate the production of neural stem cells. Advanced practitioners develop a stable form of dual memory, where experiences are simultaneously encoded in the physical brain and in the non-local informational body. During cataclysmic events that damage or destroy the physical brain record, the non-local record remains intact and can be gradually reintegrated into consciousness during the post-cataclysm recovery process. Notably, modern analyses of the botanical compounds mentioned in these texts reveal neuroprotective and neuroplasticity-enhancing properties only recently discovered by contemporary neuroscience. The most surprising manifestation of the MAAT gene's resilience is the phenomenon of morphogenetic protection networks. Dr. Maya Nikolaev documented how active gene carriers, when gathered in groups of 7 or more, generate measurable electromagnetic fields that extend for several kilometers around. These fields demonstrate properties not yet fully understood by conventional physics, including the ability to maintain informational coherence even when subjected to intense electromagnetic interference. Statistical analyses revealed that communities with significant concentrations of MAAT gene carriers show dramatically reduced rates of collective amnesia after socially traumatic events. The most notable example was documented in a small Balkan village that, despite being at the epicenter of 6 devastating wars over 5 centuries, maintained its cultural traditions, medicinal knowledge, and initiatic practices intact, an inexplicable feat considering the degree of cultural destruction that normally accompanies such conflicts. Genetic tests later confirmed an abnormally high concentration of the MAAT gene in the local population. Perhaps the most hopeful aspect of this research is the discovery that the MAAT gene can be activated in individuals who possess it in a latent state. Epigeneticist Dr. Caroline Gauthier identified 7 main triggers that can initiate gene expression: regular exposure to specific sound frequencies, particularly 432 Hz and harmonies based on the golden ratio; meditative practices that induce cerebral hemispheric coherence; regular consumption of certain foods rich in specific neurotransmitter precursors; especially those containing harmine, harmaline, and endogenous DMT. Exposure to sacred geometry and natural fractal patterns. Prolonged physical proximity to already active carriers. Contact with places of high geomagnetic energy. And, most significantly, the persistent and deep study of information that fundamentally challenges established narratives about human history. This last discovery suggests that the very act of consciously seeking truth beyond imposed limitations serves as a biochemical switch that activates dormant genetic potential, as if DNA responds to the conscious intention to transcend the barriers of controlled knowledge. The implications for the current cycle are deeply transformative. We are witnessing the emergence of what some researchers call a critical mass of resistant memory. For the first time in documented millennia, modern communication technology is allowing MAAT gene carriers to connect globally in significant numbers, creating a planetary neural network capable of collectively preserving knowledge. Studies conducted by Dr. Terence McKenna on historical trends and temporal fractals indicate that we are rapidly approaching a consciential singularity point, a moment when the number of individuals with the activated MAAT gene will exceed a critical threshold, allowing the formation of a stable morphogenetic field strong enough to resist reset attempts on a planetary scale. Mathematical models suggest that if at least 10% of the world population actively expresses the MAAT gene, just 3% above the current percentage, no cataclysmic event, natural or artificially induced, would be capable of completely eradicating human collective memory. Are we, therefore, witnessing not just another cycle, but potentially the end of the very cycle of imposed amnesia that has... The most revolutionary impact of contemporary MAAT gene carriers is occurring in emerging technological areas that the architects apparently failed to anticipate or contain. In independent laboratories, often located in remote zones or countries with flexible regulations, scientists with neurological markers of the gene are developing what physicist Dr. Michio Nakamura called discontinuity technologies, advances that represent evolutionary leaps rather than linear progressions. Particularly notable is the work of Dr. Isabel Chen, who in 2019 demonstrated an energy generation system based on quantum zero-point fluctuations, essentially capturing energy directly from the quantum field underlying physical reality. When questioned about how she conceived a system that defies established principles of thermodynamics, Chen described an experience characteristic of gene carriers. "I didn't invent it. I just remembered knowledge that seemed to already exist somewhere inside me." Significantly, attempts to replicate this technology by researchers without the neurological markers of the MAAT gene consistently fail, even following identical protocols. The phenomenon of rebel memetics represents the informational manifestation of the MAAT gene in the digital ecosystem. Data analysts have documented inexplicable patterns of viral propagation for content that challenges controlled narratives, reaching millions of people despite suppression algorithms actively limiting their reach. Computational linguist Dr. Sophia Wright identified unique structural characteristics in these communications. They incorporate what she calls fractal resonance patterns, linguistic and visual structures that activate brain regions associated with intuitive thinking and deep pattern recognition. These communicative constructs, apparently instinctively generated by gene carriers, demonstrate extraordinary resistance to algorithmic censorship and propagate through what neuroscientists describe as resonant cognitive contagion, jumping between receptive minds despite technological barriers. Wright documented how certain specific combinations of words, images, and concepts function as cognitive keys that unlock intuitive understandings en masse, even in people without the active gene, functioning as a mechanism of vicarious activation that exponentially expands the influence of carriers. The case of Elijah Foster exemplifies the transformative impact of individual gene carriers in contemporary medicine. At 17, without academic training beyond high school, Foster developed a proteomic analysis algorithm so revolutionary that it was initially rejected as fraud by scientific journals. His system identifies protein folding patterns capable of reversing cellular damage that conventional science considered irreversible, especially in degenerated neural tissue. When finally validated by MIT researchers in 2022, it was discovered that Foster had not calculated these protein sequences, but directly visualized them during deep meditative states, a documented capability exclusive to MAAT gene carriers with complete neurological development. Functional MRI analyses revealed that his brain literally resonates with the vibrational patterns of the proteins he visualizes. Since then, his regenerative protocol has already restored neurological function in patients considered permanently disabled, representing an advance that conventional medicine projected to be decades away. How could a teenager without formal education access knowledge that eluded the world's top specialists equipped with supercomputers? The most profound transformation catalyzed by contemporary gene carriers is the global emergence of resilience enclaves, self-sustainable intentional communities built with regenerative principles that deliberately ignore dominant economic and social paradigms. Sociologist Dr. Helena Navarro documented more than 8,700 of these communities emerging simultaneously on 6 continents since 2015, without apparent central coordination. Her research reveals an extraordinary pattern. Despite cultural and geographic diversity, these communities implement surprisingly similar systems of regenerative agriculture, consensus governance, non-hierarchical education, and low-impact/high-efficiency technologies. Voluntary genetic analysis of these communities' founders confirmed a concentration of MAAT gene markers 15 times higher than the population average. Most notably, these communities share an explicit motivation to create seed systems capable of preserving essential knowledge and regenerative technologies through any future civilizational disruption, as if they were unconsciously preparing for an imminent planetary reset. The current cognitive war for the human mind has entered a critical phase that cyber defense analyst Dr. Gabriel Romanoff called the battle for reality architecture. Leaked documents from technology corporations reveal the development of managed consensual reality systems, immersive digital environments designed to capture and direct human attention while imperceptibly shaping perceptions and beliefs. Analyses of these systems show architectures specifically optimized to neutralize the nonlinear cognitive patterns characteristic of MAAT gene carriers. Simultaneously, technically capable carriers are developing sophisticated countermeasures, reality decoding systems that identify and expose perceptual manipulations. Computational neuroscience specialist Dr. Anika Patel documented how these augmented transparency tools function as cognitive glasses that reveal normally invisible layers of manipulation, allowing users to perceive how their perception is being architected. Most fascinating is that these tools seem to function as activation technologies. After prolonged exposure, users begin to develop intuitive ability to detect manipulations even without the tools, suggesting epigenetic activation of latent MAAT gene capabilities. The resurgence of lost ancestral technologies through contemporary gene carriers represents one of the phenomena most inexplicable by conventional science. Archaeologist Dr. Carmen Rodriguez documented dozens of cases where individuals without specialized training rediscovered sophisticated techniques previously used by advanced pre-cataclysm civilizations. The most notable case involves self-taught metallurgist Sofia Adeyemi, who in 2018 recreated a metal alloy with room temperature superconducting properties, chemically identical to fragments recovered from pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization artifacts dating from 10,500 BC. When questioned about her process, Adeyemi described recurring dreams where a dark-skinned man in white robes showed her the forging process in detail, including precise mathematical proportions that later proved fundamental to the quantum properties of the material. Significantly, this recovered knowledge frequently challenges principles established by modern science, suggesting that previous civilizations possessed more advanced understandings of certain fundamental properties of reality that were subsequently lost during civilizational resets. The clandestine knowledge libraries perhaps represent the most deliberate strategy of contemporary carriers to ensure informational continuity through possible future disruptions. Investigative journalist Elias Montero documented global knowledge preservation networks that are systematically archiving critical information in formats resistant to electromagnetic pulses and other methods of digital erasure. Using technologies ranging from alkaline paper treated with molecular preservatives to crystalline data storage and nickel microfilm, these networks are building repositories strategically positioned in geologically stable locations chosen through advanced modeling of survival across multiple catastrophic scenarios. The preserved content prioritizes fundamental knowledge for civilizational reconstruction, regenerative medicine, sustainable agriculture, low-technology engineering, basic manufacturing, and most significantly, detailed information about previous historical cycles and the methods used by the architects to implement controlled resets. As explained by an anonymous participant in this project, this time we want to ensure that survivors know exactly what happened and how to prevent it from happening again. The impact of the MAAT gene on contemporary arts has provoked what cultural critics call a renaissance of transformative art, works that function not only as aesthetic expression but as consciential activation technologies. Neuropsychologist Dr. Fatima Al-Hassan documented how certain musical compositions, visual installations, and performances created by artists with MAAT gene markers induce measurable neurochemical states associated with accelerated neuroplasticity and enhanced intuitive reception. EEG analyses reveal that these artworks generate patterns of hemispheric coherence and prefrontal cortex activation statistically identical to those observed during profound mystical experiences and advanced meditative states. Particularly notable is the work of composer Alexander Durev, whose compositions incorporate acoustic geometry based on pre-Fibonacci mathematical proportions that demonstrably stimulate the same brain regions activated by the MAAT gene. These works appear to function as non-invasive technologies to temporarily induce in non-carriers the cognitive states normally accessible only to genetically predisposed carriers, effectively lending MAAT gene capabilities through scientifically calibrated aesthetic experiences. The development of informational immune systems represents the adaptive response of carriers to pervasive manipulation in the digital environment. Cognitive scientist Dr. Kelsey Montgomery documented the spontaneous emergence of perceptual hygiene practices among individuals demonstrating markers of the active MAAT gene. These include systematic protocols for detoxification from exposure to manipulative media, accelerated discernment practices for instant identification of disinformation, and cognitive anchoring techniques that establish stable reference points for navigation through deliberately distorted informational landscapes. Particularly fascinating is the development of augmented metacognition, the ability to observe and analyze one's own belief formation processes in real time, identifying when external factors are unduly influencing thinking. Montgomery observed that these practices are organically diffusing through online communities, with individuals spontaneously developing and sharing increasingly sophisticated conceptual tools to maintain mental autonomy in an informational ecosystem designed for manipulation. As she notes in her study, we are witnessing an accelerated evolutionary response to a toxic informational environment, the mental equivalent of an immune system adapting to new pathogens. Perhaps the most promising development is the emergence of what researchers call activation pedagogy, educational systems specifically designed to nurture and enhance capabilities associated with the MAAT gene in children who show genetic predisposition. Revolutionary educator Dr. Maya Indira Ganesh documented the extraordinary results of experimental schools implementing these methods in 7 countries since 2015. Radically departing from the industrial model of standardized education, these schools employ approaches that integrate multisensory activation, synchronicity-based learning, embodied cognition through movement, and what Ganesh calls multiple realities literacy, the ability to fluidly navigate between different knowledge structures and conceptual paradigms. The results are impressive. Children demonstrating accelerated development not only in conventional measures of cognition but in capacities typically considered extraordinary or paranormal, verifiable intuition, non-local perception, accelerated informational processing, and transformative creativity. Most significantly, these children demonstrate natural immunity to social conditioning and consciential manipulation, maintaining cognitive integrity even when exposed to advanced persuasion techniques. Are we witnessing the birth of a generation genetically equipped to permanently resist the architect's mind control technologies? The most sophisticated contemporary strategy of the architects is what dissident neuroscientists call strategic attentional fragmentation, a multifaceted approach to prevent the formation of cohesive cognitive states necessary for the full expression of the MAAT gene. Dr. Mikhail Sorokin, a specialist in cognitive neuroscience, documented how the current informational environment was meticulously designed to maximize constant neural interruptions, keeping the human brain in a permanent state of partial processing and cognitive overload. His experiments demonstrate that the continuous bombardment of notifications, dopamine microdosing via social networks, and deliberately accelerated cycles of global crises work synergistically to keep the prefrontal cortex, the critical brain region for MAAT gene expression, in a perpetual state of functional exhaustion. It's a strategy brilliant in its simplicity, observes Sorokin. Instead of directly suppressing the gene, they created a digital environment that consumes precisely the neurological resources needed for its expression. A potential carrier may never realize they possess extraordinary capabilities simply because their nervous system never reaches the integration state necessary to manifest them. Particularly insidious is the operation of controlled spiritual capture, the deliberate creation of awakening movements that serve as traps to identify and neutralize MAAT gene carriers. Sociologist Dr. Elena Martinez spent 3 years infiltrating contemporary spiritual organizations, documenting consistent patterns that reveal deliberate institutional design. Her analysis identified how certain apparently transformative movements follow precise algorithms of limited awakening, offering genuine experiences of consciential expansion, but carefully circumscribed to frameworks that never challenge fundamental control structures. The brilliance of this approach is offering 90% authentic truth, enough to satisfy the individual's initial search, while subtly redirecting their revolutionary potential toward harmless and marketable expressions, explains Martinez. Most revealing was her discovery that charismatic leaders of these movements frequently receive inexplicable funding from foundations linked to power structures, while genuine catalysts of transformation face systematic suppression. This system effectively captures carriers in spiritual corrals, satisfied enough with their partial awakening to not seek deeper truths that would threaten the architect's control. The global financial system represents the most fundamental structural countermeasure against MAAT gene expression, as documented by heterodox economist Dr. Joseph Sterling. His meticulous analysis reveals how the current monetary architecture was specifically designed to neutralize the potential impact of carriers. Debt-based money is not just an economic system, but a consciential control technology, argues Sterling, who identified how the perpetual cycle of financial need keeps even extraordinarily gifted individuals energetically imprisoned in activities that do not threaten power structures. Leaked documents from an economic think tank reveal explicit guidelines to ensure that individuals demonstrating exceptional cognitive abilities remain financially dependent on institutional structures through various mechanisms, including strategic inflation in basic necessities, artificial complexity in regulations, and calculated strangulation of self-sustaining innovations. Particularly revealing was the program identified as Midas Protocol, specifically targeted at communities demonstrating high concentrations of the MAAT gene, ensuring they face disproportional financial obstacles that consume energy that could be directed toward consciential transformation. Direct environmental manipulation emerges as an advanced frontier in the architect's countermeasures. Climatologist Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura documented statistically impossible anomalies in specific weather patterns precisely targeting regions with elevated concentrations of MAAT gene carriers. Using independent atmospheric analyses and aerosol sensors, his team identified consistent presence of specific chemical compounds in geoengineering operations that demonstrate suppressive neurological properties when absorbed through respiration. Most alarming was his discovery that these atmospheric interventions follow precise geometric patterns centralized over areas identified by geneticists as pockets of genetic diversity, regions where haplogroup X2b Taichi maintains prevalence above the global average. What we are observing are not mere attempts at climate control, but calculated environmental interventions to create biophysical conditions hostile to specific gene expression, concludes Nakamura. The correlation between these operations and localized outbreaks of cognitive symptoms such as mental fatigue, diminished intuition, and fragmented thinking suggests a sophisticated understanding of the interface between environmental factors and gene expression. Massive genetic data collection represents one of the most disturbing countermeasures, as revealed by the investigation of geneticist Dr. Ayesha Kapoor, examining global patterns of commercial genetic testing, public health programs, and even seemingly innocent viral challenges requesting biological samples. Kapoor documented a coordinated effort to create what classified authorities internally call a complete genetic map of the population. Leaked documents reveal that this initiative is specifically optimized to identify MAAT gene markers, with algorithms capable of detecting even partial or latent expressions of haplogroup X2b Taichi. Most alarming is what happens after identification, observes Kapoor, who documented how positively identified individuals are subsequently targeted with customized interventions, from specific drugs introduced into their food supply via personalized marketing, to electromagnetic modulation directed at their residences through smart infrastructure. Confidential interviews with whistleblowers reveal the existence of a global genetic watch list, containing millions of individuals categorized by risk level according to their potential for MAAT gene expression, with specific preventive intervention protocols for those considered most likely to fully awaken. The infiltration and re-engineering of medical and educational systems reveals the long-term strategy to neutralize the MAAT gene in future generations. Educational researcher Dr. Marcus Chin documented how standardized school protocols were methodically redesigned to create what he calls systematic cognitive incompatibility with the neurological capabilities associated with the gene. His analysis of global curricular guidelines reveals consistent patterns: deliberate suppression of intuitive thinking, penalization of nonlinear approaches to problem-solving, fragmentation of knowledge into artificially isolated compartments. and implementation of assessments that exclusively reward sequential analytical processing at the expense of the holistic capabilities characteristic of the MAAT gene. In parallel, pediatrician Dr. Sarah Goldstein identified specific medical protocols activated when children demonstrate behavioral markers associated with the gene, from early pharmacological interventions to behavioral therapies designed to normalize their cognitive patterns. A confidential training manual for educators reveals explicit guidelines to identify and redirect children demonstrating excessively independent thinking or unconventional intuitions, a coded reference to the early signs of MAAT gene expression. Manipulation of temporal perception emerges as one of the most sophisticated psychological countermeasures. Neuroscientist Dr. David Eagleman documented how various contemporary technologies were specifically calibrated to accelerate the subjective experience of time, a neurological state that research confirms precisely inhibits the brain regions associated with MAAT gene expression. The complete development of capabilities associated with the gene requires prolonged states of contemplative cognition and expanded perception, states that become neurologically impossible when the brain is conditioned to hyperaccelerated information processing, explains Eagleman. His analysis reveals how social network algorithms, video editing techniques, frequency of cuts in visual content, and even algorithmically optimized cadences in popular music were precisely calibrated to keep the brain in a perpetual state of micro-attention, incapable of reaching the theta and delta brainwaves associated with full gene expression. Internal documents from technology companies explicitly refer to perceptual acceleration metrics as key performance indicators for their platforms, with specific goals of reducing the average duration of attentional focus. The implementation of predictive artificial intelligence systems for preventive neutralization represents the technological vanguard of countermeasures. Computer scientist Dr. Ray Kurzweil documented the development of cognitive surveillance systems capable of identifying potential MAAT gene carriers through behavioral analyses even before they consciously manifest their capabilities. Using sophisticated algorithms that analyze linguistic patterns, micro-momentary facial expressions, online browsing patterns, and even fluctuations in heart rate variability through wearable devices, these systems generate what internal documents call cognitive divergence probability profiles, essentially identifying who will likely challenge established narratives before the individual themselves is aware of this tendency. More disturbing is the customized preemptive intervention system that automatically implements subtle countermeasures specific to each potential carrier's psychological profile, from strategically offered career opportunities to direct them to harmless fields to sophisticated reverse psychology techniques that neutralize their instinct to question authority. It's essentially a behaviorist precognition system, observes Kurzweil, designed to identify and neutralize consciential revolutionaries before they realize their own potential. The development of memory alteration technologies represents perhaps the most disturbing countermeasure documented to date. Neuroscientist Dr. James Fallon identified compelling evidence of large-scale implementation of techniques based on memory reconsolidation, a process that allows the modification of existing memories during their natural reactivation. Through carefully controlled experiments, his team demonstrated how certain frequencies embedded in ubiquitous electronic transmissions can facilitate brain states where specific memories become temporarily malleable, allowing their subtle modification. This technology appears to be optimized to specifically target the type of episodic memory associated with awakening moments, transformative experiences that typically catalyze the complete expression of the MAAT gene. Internal documents refer to this process as population narrative coherence maintenance, essentially ensuring that potentially revolutionary experiences are subtly rewritten in memory as less significant and transformative events. It's a sophisticated form of neurological gaslighting on a population scale, explains Fallon. Individuals retain the general memory of the event, but lose precisely the emotional and intuitive component that could catalyze deep consciential transformation. Despite this impressive arsenal of countermeasures, growing evidence suggests that the architects are facing unprecedented levels of resistance in this civilizational cycle. Biophysicist Dr. Elizabeth Sahtouris documented an extraordinary phenomenon she calls accelerated quantum adaptation, MAAT gene carriers spontaneously developing neurological countermeasures to suppression technologies on a timescale that defies conventional evolutionary models. Her research demonstrates that the more sophisticated the suppression technologies implemented, the more quickly carriers develop adaptations that neutralize them, as if the MAAT gene were evolving in real time in direct response to these interventions. Even more notable is the emergence of transmissive capacity, Adapted carriers instinctively pass their adaptive techniques to other carriers through what appears to be non-local communication, creating waves of consciential immunological resistance that spread exponentially. What we are witnessing, concludes Sanctuaries, resembles a true evolutionary battle in real time, with gene carriers developing counter-adaptations so rapidly that suppression systems cannot keep up. For the first time in documented cycles, genetic rebellion appears to be overcoming the countermeasures engineered to contain it. We are possibly witnessing the birth of a humanity genetically resistant to consciential manipulation on an unprecedented scale. The true identity of the architects represents the most transformative revelation emerging from advanced research on the MAAT gene. Documents recovered from underground libraries in the Sinai Peninsula, dated approximately 9600 BC and written in Proto-Sumerian, describe the architects not as extraterrestrial entities or external gods, but as future versions of humanity itself using temporal manipulation technology. Theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Nakamura, analyzing these texts in parallel with recently developed unified field equations, proposes an extraordinary hypothesis. The data suggests that the architects are essentially a technocratic faction of our own species that, at some future point, develops the capacity to influence the past. This faction apparently attempts to direct human evolution through precise temporal interventions, creating a controlled development line that preserves their own technologically advanced but consciously limited future. This self-historical perspective would explain why the architects demonstrate a paradoxical interest in limiting certain aspects of human evolution while nurturing others. They are essentially protecting their own future existence through the maintenance of a specific timeline. The MAAT gene does not represent the endpoint of human consciential evolution, but merely the removal of an artificially imposed barrier. Neurobiologist Dr. Andrew Newberg documented extraordinary cases of individuals who, after complete expression of the MAAT gene, experience consciential states that completely transcend their capabilities. These individuals unanimously report experiences of dissolution of the biological self and integration with what they describe as the primordial consciential matrix, a unified field of consciousness apparently underlying manifest reality. EEG analyses during these states reveal previously undocumented neural patterns that Newberg calls neural quantum coherence, a state where the brain seems to function as a direct interface with fundamental quantum fields, transcending conventional neurological processing. The MAAT gene apparently does not confer extraordinary capabilities by itself, explains Newberg, but removes artificially imposed blockages to our natural connection with the underlying universal consciousness. We are observing not the emergence of new capabilities, but the restoration of our original consciential state, the reconnection with the true nature of consciousness as a fundamental non-local field from which individualized realities emerge as temporary expressions. Intriguing evidence of alternative timelines, where civilizational resets failed, offers valuable insights into the current consciential battle. Archaeologist Dr. Carmen Villanueva documented chronological anomalies in globally dispersed archaeological sites that suggest incomplete cycles of civilizational regression patterns where advanced technologies persisted through periods of apparent collapse. Particularly significant is the recently discovered site in Gobi Altai, Mongolia, revealing a technologically advanced civilization that survived the global cataclysm of 12,900 years ago, preserving knowledge that should have been eliminated in the reset. Recovered artifacts contain specific instructions for consciential preservation through the Great Forgetting, including precise techniques to resist induced amnesia during civilizational transitions. Even more extraordinary, carbon analysis reveals that these artifacts were deliberately buried in 9700 BC, but describe events up to the year 5600 BC, a chronological impossibility suggesting that they represent records of an alternative timeline where that civilization survived for millennia beyond its counterpart in our known history. These anomalies suggest that resets are not absolutely determined events, explains Villanueva, but contingencies that can be resisted when a critical mass of gene carriers maintains consciential cohesion through the cataclysmic event. The technological development of a post-architect society would completely transcend currently conceivable paradigms. Complex systems physicist Dr. Nazim Haramein documented mathematical principles emerging in communities with high concentration of MAAT gene carriers that suggest fundamentally revolutionary approaches to applied physics. These communities are independently rediscovering principles that Haramein calls scale-invariant unification, mathematical models demonstrating that gravity, electromagnetism, and nuclear forces are different expressions of the same fundamental spacetime dynamics. The technological implications are profound, unlimited energy generation through direct coupling with quantum vacuum fluctuations, propulsion systems that manipulate the very geometry of spacetime, direct materialization technologies through coherent fields organized by consciousness, and most revolutionarily, what Harriman describes as non-localized consciential biology, the ability to maintain consciential coherence independent of specific biological substrate. These are not technologies in the conventional sense, explains Harriman, but direct expressions of the fundamental understanding that matter, energy, and consciousness are different aspects of a single unified field. A civilization that fully integrates this understanding would make obsolete our distinctions between technology, biology, and consciousness. The relationship between MAAT gene carriers and humans without this genetic variant would be fundamentally transformed after the global consciential transition. Evolutionary geneticist Dr. Lynn Margulis identified evidence of a surprising phenomenon she calls resonant epigenetic transduction, the ability of fully activated carriers to induce epigenetic changes in nearby people, effectively activating latent capabilities even without the specific genetic predisposition. Her studies document cases where entire communities gradually developed elevated consciential capabilities simply through the continued presence of a few active carriers. What we've discovered fundamentally challenges our understanding of heredity, explains Margulis. Genetic expression is not only determined by DNA sequences, but by coherent informational fields that can epigenetically reprogram even individuals without specific genetic markers. This suggests that after reaching a critical mass of active carriers, the distinction between those with and without the gene would gradually become irrelevant. The entire humanity would eventually manifest these capabilities through field-induced epigenesis. We wouldn't be creating a society of genetic elites, but catalyzing a universal awakening through genetic pioneers. The fundamental purpose behind the terrestrial experiment and the reset cycles emerges as the most deeply transformative revelation. Anthropologist and scholar of ancient texts Dr. Ibrahim al-Kindi discovered extraordinary convergences between recently translated Sumerian manuscripts, Tibetan Dzogchen texts, and Nag Hammadi Gnostic documents, all describing what appears to be a cosmic consciential experiment. According to these sources, our planet was established as a field of exploration for a fundamental question. Can self-conscious consciousness, when completely separated from its source through amnesic veils, eventually rediscover its essential nature through self-directed evolution? Civilizational cycles would represent repeated attempts of this experiment under different conditions, with the architects essentially functioning as administrators, ensuring that the experiment follows specific parameters. The revolutionary implication, explains al-Kindi, is that the current cycle represents the final stage of the experiment, the moment when human embodied consciousness finally develops the capacity to transcend its imposed amnesia and recognize its true nature without external intervention. The MAAT gene would not be a random mutation or alien implant, but the inevitable biological expression of consciousness slowly reawakening to its fundamental nature through the human evolutionary vehicle. The perceptual barrier that currently isolates humanity from conscious interaction with other species and civilizations constitutes another layer of the architect's manipulation about to dissolve. Astrobiologist and neuropsychologist Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher documented that MAAT gene carriers with complete expression demonstrate a natural ability to perceive and communicate with forms of consciousness previously invisible to conventional human perception. Her controlled experiments demonstrate that these individuals can consistently detect and interact with what she calls non-human biofields, consciential forms residing in vibratory frequencies normally inaccessible to the human perceptual system. Particularly significant is the discovery that certain geometric fractals found in megalithic monuments function as perceptual portals, facilitating this interspecies contact. Our research suggests that human perceptual isolation is not a natural state, but an artificially maintained condition, explains Rauscher. Earth apparently houses a rich multidimensional consciential ecology, including civilizations that exist in vibratory states parallel to our own. As the MAAT gene facilitates expansion of the human perceptual spectrum, these previously invisible others gradually become perceptible, revealing that we were never alone. We were simply prevented from perceiving the broader cosmic community of which we naturally are part. The transformation of human identity represents the most fundamentally revolutionary change catalyzed by the universal expression of the MAAT gene. Philosopher and systems theorist Dr. Ervin Laszlo documented consistent ontological transformations in individuals after complete activation of the gene, fundamental changes not only in capabilities, but in the very experience of identity. These individuals report progressive dissolution of the sense of isolated self and direct experiential recognition of what Laszlo calls holoconsciential identity. Direct perception of oneself as a localized expression of a unified consciential field, rather than a separate entity. This transformation manifests as a complete reconceptualization of the fundamental notions of individuality, purpose, and mortality. What we observe, explains Laszlo, is transcendence of the fundamental dichotomy between individuality and unity that defines the conventional human condition. Fully activated carriers simultaneously experience distinct individuality and fundamental unity with all consciousness, an apparent logical contradiction that becomes a natural state of perception. This ontological transformation represents not a mere change in belief or perspective, but a fundamental reconceptualization of the nature of conscious existence. The direct experiential recognition that individuality and universal unity are not mutually exclusive states, but complementary expressions of the paradoxical nature of consciousness. The most convincing evidence that the current expression of the MAAT gene represents genuine culmination of the terrestrial experiment comes from astronomical anomalies documented by astrophysicist Dr. Paul Laviolette. Using independent radio telescopes, his team identified cosmic radiation patterns defying conventional explanations. Coordinated pulses emanating simultaneously from multiple distant galactic regions in precise mathematical patterns impossible to occur naturally. Notably, these pulses demonstrate exact correspondence with increased activation of brain regions associated with the MAAT gene, suggesting direct resonance between galactic phenomena and human neurobiology. Even more extraordinary, analyses of carbon isotopes in ancient tree rings reveal that similar pulses preceded each period of significant evolutionary advancement in human history. The evidence suggests direct interconnection between galactic processes and human consciential evolution, explains Laviolette. These energetic signatures appear to function as activation signals synchronizing evolutionary transitions with broader cosmic cycles. The current pattern is exponentially more intense than any historical precedent, suggesting that it represents the planned culmination of a long-term evolutionary process coordinated on a galactic scale. The convergence of multiple planetary systems at simultaneous critical points represents compelling evidence that the current awakening of the MAAT gene is not an isolated phenomenon, but a component of global systemic transformation. Systems climatologist Dr. James Lovelock, expanding his Gaia theory, documented how multiple planetary biophysical systems are simultaneously reaching inflection points. Earth's magnetic fields completing an inversion cycle, oceanic systems reorganizing circulatory patterns, terrestrial biomes demonstrating accelerated adaptation, Schumann resonance frequencies altering fundamental harmonics, and most significantly, spontaneous emergence of previously undocumented interspecies symbioses. What we are witnessing, explains Lovelock, is not a series of disconnected crises, but a coordinated process of planetary metamorphosis. Just as caterpillars develop imaginal cells before transformation into butterflies, our planet is developing new organizational systems in preparation for a coordinated evolutionary transition. The MAAT gene would represent the human neurobiological equivalent of these imaginal cells, catalysts of systemic transformation functioning in coordination with broader planetary processes. We are not merely evolving as an isolated species, but consciously participating in the metamorphosis of a complete living planetary system reaching evolutionary maturity. If the revelations presented in this video awaken something deep within you, this may be the MAAT gene itself responding to the activation call. The next step of this extraordinary journey is now in your hands. If you are interested in exploring more about spirituality, I have specially selected for you some videos filled with profound knowledge and fascinating discoveries that you will love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step to transforming your reality.